Well, it's funny that you would ask that. We just on JS Lines that we do a weekly call for subscribers, and we did a 2-hour call that we broke into two segments on being prepared. And obviously, your location is of utmost importance. I mean, you could be 100% prepared and have all kinds of stuff ready to use, ready to live on, but if you're in an urban area, you're going to get overrun. There's too much population. You have no idea who's friend or foe. You don't have any idea which direction danger is going to come at you from. I mean, just look at the BLM riots. Look at the couple in St. Louis standing out on the front porch with a pistol and an AR. Yeah, they could have defended it with that small crowd, but you've got to sleep. There are times when your guard is not 100% up. The point being, in an urban environment, when the financial system goes down, in my opinion, you're dead. You will not make it. We have recommended that people, if they want to or have to live in an urban environment, try to have a second location, a property that's at least, say, 30 miles, 40 miles outside of an urban area, and you want to get outside of the suburban area. You want to live rural, because when this goes down, when the financial system goes down, credit's going to go down, and basically everything's going to go down. And I think what you could do is you could look to Venezuela as your roadmap. The way things progressed in Venezuela, with power outages, et cetera, problems with clean water, that's what happens when a society starts to break down. And that's the reason if you're living in a rural area, you want to make sure that you have the ability to filtrate water. You want to make sure you have the ability to produce energy for yourself, because frankly, the grid will more than likely go down in a credit collapse. Pretty much everything will go down in a credit collapse because everything runs on credit.
So there's a lot of other things in addition to what you mentioned about physical security and the stresses that will come to our system from the financial collapse. Another thing is about food security. And inherently, if you're living in a rural environment, you have options for your accessibility to sources of food that you don't necessarily have in the city or suburban environment. Correct.
I mean, you can farm yourself, you can fish, you can hunt. If you have metal to barter with, I mean, there's probably within a 1 mile radius of me, there's probably, I don't know, 500 or 1,000 head of cattle. So, bartering with a farmer for whatever they produce, or protein, meat, that's not something that you'd ever find in an urban environment. And believe me, I've spoken to many farmers. They do understand junk silver. I mean, I've kind of prepared ahead of time, kind of trying to meet farmers, and I've asked them, will you accept junk silver? And they basically say they'd rather take junk silver now, and of course will later, but they understand metal versus fiat.
Yeah, in fact, every generation understood that up to our grandparents, and then just the last 2 to 3 generations have been basically dumbed down to where it becomes something that you have to re-educate ourselves just to reawaken to something that was just intrinsically the default to all generations prior to that. Maybe we should take a minute just to talk about that. In your view, the loss of cultural understanding of metals in our generations, what do you see as far as how that occurred and what we can do about it, first of all, in our own families, and then maybe with the people that we come in contact with?
Well, how it occurred, that's pretty much an easy one. Once in 1964, 65, when they went off, they took the coin off of silver, and then 1971, Nixon taking us off the gold standard. From that point forward, there has been a concerted effort to prove to the population that paper is good and gold/silver is bad. And that's why you see these paper smackdowns in gold and silver. I mean, here we are on the cusp of all kinds of things breaking down, and could include World War III. And they're trying to portray that people are panicking out of gold and silver, which is completely ridiculous. I can almost guarantee you that physical gold, physical silver is not being sold to push these prices down. It's done on COMEX, it's done on LME, it's done with paper contracts that have no gold nor silver behind them to deliver. So it's a paper product. In today's world, people, I mean, you could go into almost probably every major city in the U.S. and just ask people, kind of like Mark Dice does, just walk around and ask them, whether or not they need farmers. And they'd be like, no, I'll just go to my grocery store. I'll call Amazon or email Amazon, and the stuff will show up in 2 days. So, what do we need farmers for? I don't need to interact with a farmer because I can get it off my phone. And it's unbelievable in my view. I mean, I'm over 60 years old. I was born, my first recollection of life was JFK's assassination. And from there to here, there's no resemblance whatsoever to what life used to be as opposed to what it is now.
Bill, we just had an interruption because the doorbell rang and you were doing some preparedness. Can you let our viewers know what it was that interrupted our interview?
Yeah, I did not expect it to be, or when we set up this interview, I didn't expect this to be today, but we have we had a crew out there that was adding an additional 1,000 gallon storage for propane. And I've got dogs in the house, and they had to come in, relight the pilot lights. They're all done. That's all taken care of. But the whole idea was you need to have enough fuel supply to last more than a full year. And in a full year, we won't go through 1,500 or 2,000 gallons. We might go through 1,100, 1,200 gallons. My thought process was get the bigger tank, have enough to go for more than a year. And I may even add one more tank to it, so I'd be able to get more than 2 years' time. And my thought process is, over a year's time, somehow, some way, I'd be able to find propane, hopefully, depending upon how badly the system goes down. But that's the reason for the interruption.
Yeah, and it made me remember that we were looking at a property where the owner had a leaking 500-gallon buried propane tank, and he was going to have that removed and a replacement tank put in, and he decided to go on the cheap and have them put in a 100-gallon replacement. I was trying very hard to lobby with him. I said, you don't even have a whole house generator. If you did add one, you could have a failover for power. If you ran out, you could have propane power. Go big on your replacement tank. And he didn't want to do that. So that's something that everybody has to make that decision as how much is enough to have as a spare. But it's good to think in terms of a timeline, how far that could get you down the road as you described.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, we had a very related question here submitted by a viewer. Mustang Rider asks, he said, recently I had an epiphany that with the supply chains crippled, I need to buy and store up what I may need for next year for my family. And trying to imagine what I'd need, I bought en masse everything I could think of that I may need for next year. Some examples were air conditioning and heating filters, children's clothing, a freezer, food that we like, as well as anything we use that's manufactured overseas, such as electronics. Unfortunately, I had to go into a bit of debt to accomplish this, anticipating paying for next year's expenditures up front. My question is going into debt during this time a good move to get what we may need now for our future?
And as as we spoke about during the cut, in the next year or the following year or a few months from now, having the goods on hand is going to be way more important than having dollars in the bank or not having debt. A couple things that I've done, when we moved into this place a couple years ago, I replaced all the air conditioning units. And then, COVID was in full bloom. We had the BLM riots, and all of a sudden the supply chain started to crack, weaken, and products were difficult to find. So what I did was I went back to the air conditioning contractor, and I had him order all the parts necessary to rebuild 2 air conditioners. I also went to my well pump guy, and I ordered all the parts necessary. We have 2 separate water wells, and I ordered all the parts necessary to repair completely one of the 2 water wells. Now, obviously, we could have abandoned one and used parts from one for the other, but I thought it was good to have extra parts. I did one other thing. If we run out of power, we have solar here, but let's say we have an EMP. I have no idea. My guess is solar production would be kaput. The system would be fried. So another thing that I did was I ordered and have had installed a hand pump. You're talking about a lot of cranking to get 15, 20 gallons or whatever you need on a daily basis. But a hand pump is going to work whether the power's up or not. So, I'm just looking out ahead. I've seen all kinds of problems. This hand pump, for example, I ordered in October and I didn't get it until the end of March. So in a system down scenario, you're not going to get parts, and you might think forward as to what parts of necessities you're going to need. And you want backup systems. For instance, we cook with gas, but I went out and I bought 2 separate, if you want to call them electric stoves, electric hibachis, what have you, so that that's a second source of being able to cook. And obviously a third source is, cords of firewood, and you cook it over a fire. But just try to think forward of the things that at some point in time you're going to need, and buy them now. They're probably much, much cheaper than they're going to be in the future also.
And available at all. That's the thing, regardless of price, if you just simply can't get it. Yeah. So here's a question about price. Part-time Preppers asks, he says it's more of an observation than a question. With everything from gas, meat, lumber, ammunition skyrocketing in price, how is it that gold and silver remain stagnant?
Right. Gold and silver are the only things not affected by inflation. And that goes back to what we talked about early in this recording, is that they have to can you imagine if gold right now was, say, $2,500 or $2,700 and silver was $60 or $70 with what's been happening over the last month? You have an absolute exodus from stocks and bonds, and where would that capital go? What they've done is they've illustrated by capping the price with paper contracts that your safe haven is not gold and silver, whereas 5,000 years of history says that gold and silver are the safe haven. They are real money. And back in the old days, when it was talked about going to cash, that cash was backed by gold. So you were going to a foundational position. You were going to a no risk position by going to cash, which was, it was gold.
Prior to 1933, it was literally physically gold. It was gold coins. So in other words, that flight to cash, which is instinctive in all of our guts, is not incorrect. there's that sense that in times of great turmoil, great uncertainty, great volatility, great trouble ahead, it's natural and right and prudent to fly to cash if cash in fact is real. But we've been doing monopoly money since 1933 in the sorts of gold and 1965 in the sorts of silver. So never in the history of mankind has it been a gut sense to fly to monopoly money in the case of stress.
And that's the problem today, is a flight to cash. You've got to understand, go back to 2008 when, one of the money markets broke the buck. It was trading down to 99 or 98 cents. And had the Fed not stepped in and lent all sorts of money to keep that paper afloat, you would have had a system where cash was nothing. Cash evaporated. And that's where we are today. I mean, moving to cash now, what do you think cash is? Your average money market is commercial paper. It's backed by, XYZ corporations that are borrowing at 30 days, 60 days at a time. So there is some very real risk in parking your funds in cash, because the reality is that cash is worthless.
We have a related question here from William Mueller about the times that we find ourselves in. Bill, is it time to significantly factor in global war into the analysis of gold and silver?
Well, I mean, yeah, look at what's going on with Ukraine and Russia with their operations there. To me, it looks like the U.S./NATO wants a war. That's what their actions have been. I mean, if you go back and you look, Putin, Russia tried literally for years to try to get the Donbass situation squared away and got nowhere with it. And I think it's very important. And if you can find a link, you might want to link this to the interview. I think it's very important to spend the 10, maybe even 15 minutes it will take to read Vladimir Putin's statement before the operation started. And I read it. I believe it was reasonable, and the position that the West is taking has been unreasonable. Now, going just one step further, I have been on the record for probably 8-10 years now that when this thing goes down, it's not going to just go down on its own. The table has to be kicked over. They have to have something to point to so that they can say, well, our policies were working, and they would have worked except for whatever, this event or that event or these events. They have to point something at something to blame for the system coming down. So the answer to that question is yes.
We have a question here from another viewer. As more countries trade using their own currencies, and we've seen that happening even as these sanctions have been placed on Russia about exiting, being locked out of the SWIFT system, they've been taking accelerated steps that they had started long before, as did China and others, to start trading commodities in their own currencies, etc. So Bruce Barr says, as more countries trade using their own currencies rather than the dollar, how much will the dollar be devalued if this trend continues? Would this devaluation force the dollar to be pegged to gold to be stabilized?
I don't really know how the dollar could be pegged to gold unless we actually do have the 8,300 tons that is claimed. I highly doubt that. I view having to pay Russia for their goods in rubles, China and Russia trading in yuan and rubles, India doing trade in either rupees or rubles, and even the Saudis and other Arab nations are getting on that bandwagon. So yes, that is going to create less demand. And actually, we're even seeing, I just read a story today that it looks like the Japanese are starting to sell treasuries. That whole thing, all of this, all of what I just spoke about, I view as the fuse to the explosion. The explosion itself are the credit markets. Once the U.S., and you're starting to see that now, we've got almost a 3% 10-year treasury. Once the credit markets deny, if you will, the availability of credit to the United States, and the only thing left is the Federal Reserve buying U.S. treasuries, that's the explosion. But the lessening of demand, I view that as the fuse to the explosion.
All right, and we're certainly seeing that already from multiple directions. There's a finer question here that you and I have talked about in the past. This is a different twist on it. We've talked about people who want to acquire physical gold and silver just going for straight modern bullion versus older historical coins for different reasons. We have a viewer here who asks, if someone were to inherit an old coin collection, are there opportunities to trade numismatic coins, even including Buffalo nickels, Lincoln pennies, etc., for something with a higher intrinsic metal value, such as junk silver or modern bullion, or would you hold on to the numismatics?
Depending upon what type of numismatics. I mean, if you're talking about, nickels and pennies and small coins like that, unless you have something really special and you can turn it into much more bullion, then I would just hold on to it. But I have been an advocate for many years, and I'm speaking to Americans now. I'm not speaking to Canadians or foreigners, but to Americans, the best form of silver to hold is junk silver. The reason being, for instance, $1.38 face equals 1 ounce. So that means 13.8 dimes, call it 14 dimes, equals 1 ounce. That will give you 14 transactions versus one with an eagle or a bar or a buffalo or a maple or what have you. So it's the most broken down. It's not counterfeitable because they have to show wear, they have to be scruffy, they have to look like they were used. Everyone recognizes what a dime, a quarter, a half dollar looks like. And when you drop it on a desk, it sounds different than when you drop a current dime, quarter, half dollar on a table. So in silver, your best bet is junk. The only problem is it's become very difficult. This year, just in the last 2 months, we've had more days than not where we didn't have junk silver available to sell. It's become that scarce. When it comes to gold, you want U.S. mint lineage coin. You want eagles or buffaloes. And preferably you want pre-1933 St. Gaudens and Liberties. The reason being, if there is a confiscation, it would be more difficult for the government to come out and say, okay, well, we sold you these eagles and buffaloes last month, but now you got to turn them in because they're illegal. Now, they could do it easily with bars. They could do it easily with generic rounds. They could do it easily with foreign sovereigns like maples and again, I'm speaking to Americans. They could do it easily with maples, sovereigns, Krugerrands, you name it. U.S. mint lineage will make confiscation more difficult. Now, going one step further into the pre-1933s, those are considered collectibles. And especially if you have graded coins of MS-60 or higher, the graded coins are without doubt currently, and that could change. I mean, they could change the law. They could just go full tyranny. But if you go back to 2010, when gold was $1,000 an ounce, you could have sold an MS-63 Liberty for $1,800 and turn around and bought Eagles for $1,100. So the reason that premium expanded to 80% was because of fear that Obama was going to go through with confiscation. And the pre-33s are considered collectibles rather than bullion. So you would not be considered a hoarder, you'd be considered a coin collector. Even if you had 1,000 ounces or 2,000 ounces, you'd still be considered a coin collector as opposed to a hoarder.
That's a scenario that a lot of people ask about, and we all do our best to try to come up with what we think are reasonable predictions around what's the most likely outcome. But as we've seen in the last 2 years, it can be nigh impossible to forecast what crazy hijinks governments, whether it's in the U.S. or in Canada, even more recently, will pull as far as doing unconstitutional or unexpected things that would be formerly unthinkable and or explicitly outlawed by the Constitution, but they do it anyway.
I mean, look at Canada. If you donated $20 to the trucker, to the truckers, you had a good chance of having your bank account shut down. That's absurd. And I mean, along those lines, just how absurd it's getting. Now it looks like the Biden administration is going forward with, they're not calling it the Ministry of Truth, but that's basically what it is. They decide what's true and what's not true. And there's no First Amendment. There's no discussion. There's no debate. It's just, if you don't go along with the narrative, you're wrong. It's illegal. And who knows? They can make it so you end up going to jail because you said the wrong thing, you went to the wrong website, what have you. It's just, this is very, very dangerous. It's coming to a head.
We've interviewed multiple constitutional attorneys in the past couple of years, and one by one, the Bill of Rights, and the amendments to the Constitution, the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, on and on. Illegal search and seizure, right to bear arms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of redress of wrongs are just getting curtailed, right and left. It's serious times, and for people who object, who write comments under our videos saying, "Oh, you guys are always, calling out, the sky is falling," and that sort of thing. It's like, I don't know what they've been paying attention to for the last couple of years, but it really does seem in many ways that parts of our collective political sky are falling, and we need to take protective action. If we haven't already, this is the day. In fact, that was the point made by the next commenter. The New American Realist says, extremely important to point out that Bill Holter has and is saying we will see inflation of the things that we need, food and energy, and deflation of the things that we own, 401ks, real estate. So basically, hyperinflationary depression. Holter nailed it. Can you reiterate to us your thesis on that? Because it certainly seems to be playing out in front of our eyes.
Well, yeah, until just recently, we had an inflation of everything. Everything was going up. I mean, look at used cars. Used cars, you were able to buy a car 3 years ago, drive it for 20,000 miles, and then turn it back in for the same price that you sold it at. Food, services, gas, energy, I mean, you name it, has gone up in value. And up until just over the last few months, you saw the same thing with stocks and you saw the same thing with real estate. However, what fueled all of that basically was credit, and we saw credit start to falter last year. And there's been a lagged effect of the higher interest rates. I mean, look at, for instance, real estate. 8 months, 12 months ago, you could have gotten a mortgage for 30-year mortgage for 2.75%. Now it's 5.4. That's a double. So what that means is if you qualified for $1 million mortgage a year ago, and you didn't get a raise, you're making the same amount of money, you only qualify for $500,000. So now you're starting to see these, people put their home up for sale. They got 5 bids or 10 bids in the first 2 days, and they're all above the asking price. Those days are over. The peak has been reached, and you're also seeing that in the stock market. So you are beginning to see assets deflate, and you've definitely seen in the credit markets, bond prices have deflated hugely, but nobody watches them. All they do is they look at the interest rate and they say, "Oh, rates are going up." But understand that pension plans, The foundation to the entire financial system is based on credit. It's based on bonds. And those bond prices have been dropping like a rock since since a little over a year ago now. So the foundation itself is getting thinner and thinner, and it's going to crack. And I would also like to point out, don't again on some kind of a side subject, people have called us conspiracy theorists. We wear tinfoil hats for whack jobs. Whenever, family members, friends, you're prepping, you're getting food, you want to have at least 2 years of food, whatever, and they're telling you you're nuts. Well, if I'm not mistaken, the White House administration itself has said that there's going to be food shortages, and it's pretty obvious. I mean, you've got how many of these food processing plants have burned up? Planes have hit them. I mean, I think it's been so far this year, there's already been 18 this year. Fertilizer is difficult to get. So if the Biden administration is telling you there's going to be food shortages in 6 months, does that make us prudent for prepping and buying food, or does that make us whack jobs and we should just starve like everyone else? Because there's going to be starvation.
It's very sobering, and it makes me think of two different scripture stories. One is of Noah and the ark. Everybody thought that Noah and his sons were crazy for what they were doing, the strains that must have put on them in their community and so on, and yet they persisted. And also Joseph, son of Jacob, who interpreted the Pharaoh's dream about the 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, and convinced him to store up non-perishable produce, wheat and so on, in huge granaries, and it became the savior of their country, but also that the people who came initially brought their metals to buy food with, and later on, they sold off their lands, and finally they sold off their own work as labor, as indentured servants to pay off for food. The one who had the physical goods, as the things of life, the stuff of life, as you described, is so critical at this time. So, folks, we do exhort you to speak up if you haven't to your friends, your family members, your loved ones, and let them know that even if they think you have a tinfoil hat on, maybe they should save up some tinfoil just so that they have some of those non-perishable things on hand that they might need in addition to storable food and so on. Anyway, Bill, if people want to follow your work, where should they get plugged in?
You can go to JS Mindset, MINESET.com. You can reach me directly through email at bholter@hotmail.com. I do want to mention, like I think I mentioned this earlier in the broadcast, we did do it's roughly a 2 hour, 1 hour, 2-part series on prepping. We do a weekly call for subscribers, and one of the guys on our weekly call, his name's Dave, was one of the deepest thinkers as far as prepping is concerned. And I met a fellow a little over 2 years ago, has become a fabulous friend. He's a great Christian, and he grew up farming, ranching, for lack of better description. He runs circles as far as prepping around anyone I've ever met, and we talked with him for those 2 hours. So, I mean, I picked up something. I think anybody who listened to it picked up some things. That's well worth listening to.
Very good. Yeah, I especially appreciate that particular topical information about preparedness, because that's the mission of our channel as well. We've been speaking with Bill Holter of jsmindset.com. Bill, as always, thank you for joining us here on Liberty and Finance.